Well, good morning, everyone. Bon matin à tous. Welcome to the latest in a series of Zoom webinars presented by the Chamber of Commerce for Greater Moncton. My name is John Wishart, and I am the Chamber's CEO. Today, we're very pleased to present not one, but two speakers from Deloitte, who will lead us in a discussion on the retail outlook as we approach the holidays. As many of you on the call certainly know, November and December are critical months in the retail sector. But how are retailers faring this year amid the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic challenges that COVID has brought to our region and our country? Have consumers fundamentally shifted their habits and behaviors due to COVID? La présentation d'aujourd'hui sera suivie d'une séance de questions et réponses durant laquelle vous pourrez poser vos questions. Vous pouvez poser vos questions en utilisant les fonctions Q&A au bas de votre écran Zoom. Today's presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. And actually, I think one of our presenters mentioned he may pause during his presentation to accept some questions. So we encourage you to submit a question at any time during the presentation by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will follow up the presentation with as many questions as we have time for. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's two guest speakers. David Gibbs is Senior Manager in Deloitte's Risk Advisory Practice in St. John's, Newfoundland, and is focused on information technology risk management, including cybersecurity. David's expertise in advising organizations on IT risk ranges from development to implementation of cyber strategy and is relevant to the retail industry with the risks of the new online retail world due to COVID-19. Now, joining David is Steve Lund, who I know is familiar to many of you on today's call. Steve is a bilingual CPA and the managing partner for Deloitte in New Brunswick and PEI. Il a ouvert le bureau de Deloitte à Moncton il y a maintenant 5 ans. Et il se consacre à aider les entreprises privées canadiennes à passer au niveau suivant, que ce soit grâce à une croissance rapide, un accès aux marchés internationaux ou en diversifiant leurs activités. He helps clients by connecting them to the power of the global firm, which is 320,000 plus people strong. Steve is also Atlantic retail and consumer leader with Deloitte, and he's certainly no stranger to the Chamber of Commerce movement, as Steve is also the chair of the Atlantic Provinces Chamber. He also sits on the board of directors for CPA New Brunswick, the Atlantic School of Business, and the Greater Moncton SPCA Foundation. So with that, I'll turn over the virtual platform to Steve and David. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Mr. Wishart. Good to see your face again. It's too bad we can't see each other in person due to our orange phase, but still, nonetheless, good to see a lot of familiar faces on the participant list today. So, as John mentioned, folks, I'm going to talk us through the 2020 Deloitte Canadian Holiday Study. If you want to find the details of the report and take it as a read for later, you can just Google Deloitte 2020 Canada Holiday Study. Just be careful that you put Canada in there because the study is performed for a number of other countries, so you want to make sure you get the Canadian one. The way that we're proposing to structure the conversation, I've been on a lot of Zoom meetings, as everyone has during this time, so we're going to try to make it as interactive as possible and keep it fairly interesting. So the first 25 or 30 minutes, I'm going to walk us through the details of the report and highlight some of the key findings. I'm going to attempt to take breaks every 8 or 10 minutes to encourage some questions and conversation. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A or the chat, as John suggested. I'll pause every 10 minutes or so and chat about some of those items. Retail is a really important industry for New Brunswick and for Moncton. So I think some of the elements are going to spur some good discussion. Following that, you'll see that one of the key findings is the continued trend to digitization of the retail space, which lends itself, of course, into concerns around consumer privacy and so on. So I've invited my colleague David Gibbs, who I've worked with for years and years, and he focuses on cyber risk generally. And so we'll have a bit of a fireside chat for the last 20 or 25 minutes. And then we've got some time set aside at the end if we need it for additional questions and comments. But my goal would be, let's turn this as close as we can to one of the phenomenal in-person sessions that John normally hosts. We'll just do it virtually. So that should take us to close at around 11:55, so we can all go eat lunch, hopefully locally downtown in Moncton, which I'm sitting at right now. So that's a bit of an overview, and as you can see, this kind of times well with what you're seeing today on the agenda. So a little bit about the report and how it's created. So Deloitte has been completing these reports for a number of years. This year, of course, is probably the most unique for sure. We compile it using 2 or 3 main sources of data. One is we survey thousands of Canadians across the country, across broad demographic, geographic, and socio-economic diversity to make sure that we've got a representative blend on the survey. So we survey a whole bunch of Canadians on their retail spending plans, habits, et cetera. And then in addition to that, we layer on a whole host of economic trends and indicators that exist within our Canadian economy. And that's mostly driven by our own chief economist, Craig Alexander, who layers all of those economic trends into the survey preferences and results. And then that kind of ties into how the survey results are formed. Perfect, next slide. Okay, excellent. So what are the 5 main findings of the report? I'm going to spend a bit of time just talking about that. So the first one, which is kind of a real showstopper for sure, is that holiday spending is expected to be down this year on the whole by about 18%. So the average Canadian home would spend $1,700 last year. This is on a per person basis, right? $1,700 per person. That's expected to drop to $1,400 this year. So that's an 18% drop. 1 in 3 Canadians expect to reduce their spend. That is a Canada-wide stat, and the biggest difference relates to a reduction in travel, which is, quite frankly, with COVID, not super surprising to me. There's also a bit of a decrease in dining out because of COVID restrictions that exist. In particular, in Moncton, we're familiar with the 1 household bubble to go to a restaurant now. And so those are generally what the decreases are tied to. On the positive note for Moncton and in New Brunswick, we do have some economic trends that would indicate that we might be able to outperform the Canadian average. If you go to a study that we released from the Atlantic Provinces Economic Council just last week, actually, it was procured by the Atlantic Chamber of Commerce. I'm very familiar with it. There were, and it's called Key Economic Issues for Atlantic Canada, if anyone wants to go look it up. There were 3 really interesting stats that kind of jumped out to me from that report. One is employment is actually not as negatively impacted in New Brunswick, and especially in Moncton relative to the rest of the country. We're actually up 0.2% up to October 2020. So compared to many other regions and even other cities, Moncton's doing very, very well on employment. And so as a function of spend, that just means there's going to be more money available in our system. So that's a positive thing for Moncton that might help us work through that trend. The other is that housing prices are up pretty substantially in Moncton right now. We're up, I think, 15% is what the study has shown. So that again is just, access to refinancing and things like that on your home. That just adds ability to spend. And then that's those 2 positives are offset by 1 negative, which is immigration is down significantly I think it's over 50% at this point. So that's a big deal. So you've got two positives and one negative that might help us buck the trend. So that's number one. Number two, consumer confidence is lower, but interestingly, Canadians are feeling more charitable. And so if you look at the survey results, donations are actually going to be up or expected to be up by about 86%, which is a huge number. When I think back to what that means locally here, charity galas and dinners are obviously significantly down. And I'm not sure that the survey respondents would have included that in their charitable donation numbers. So if I'm a charity, I don't know that my budget is necessarily ballooning the way that the 86% might suggest, but it does mean that people might be spending their charitable money in different ways, which is just a pure donation rather than buying tables and things like that. The third interesting stat that came up is that COVID-19 was a huge catalyst to propel online shopping into the forefront that was already on its way to get there. And so the stats show that 47% of Canadian consumers have been shopping online more often since the outbreak began. I actually would have put the stat at even higher than that, but it's absolutely not surprising. It's not a new trend, but all it did is supercharge a trend that was already happening. The fourth trend and key item that came out is that very clearly Canadians start their holiday shopping journey at Amazon, and Amazon Prime is even better. And so the stat is that 66% of Canadian shoppers say they'll use Amazon to find and purchase gifts and other items this holiday season. That's up from 60% in the prior year. On the flip side, only 53% say they'll likely head to stores as part of their online shopping experience, as part of their total shopping experience. So Amazon is now surpassed going in a physical store, which is a very relevant piece of information, I think. The fifth one is that Canadians are buying from third-party and marketplace sellers, and they're reporting high satisfaction in doing so. And a third-party and a marketplace seller would be if you're looking at like Facebook Marketplace, if you're selling through Amazon's portal or another third-party retailer, basically the website owner has the eyeballs, and then they would auction off the space so that you can sell. So that's an important trend, that 78% of consumers made an online purchase from a marketplace seller, and most were satisfied. So that's just an additional channel for some Monctonian businesses to look at as a possibility. The next few slides will just go into detail on some of what those five mean. So I'm going to start by talking about some economic trends and in particular around confidence, because confidence drives a lot of retail purchasing. When you are confident in your own ability to generate income or that the economy will be strong, you're more likely to go out and make those types of purchases. And so there's a concerning trend here that's driving a lot of the stats that we saw earlier on holiday spend, which is 43% of Canadians expect the economy to improve or remain the same next year. That's compared to 68% last year. So there's a 25% drop as far as people's optimism on the economy for next year. A whopping 56% think that the economy will weaken, and that compares to 32% in the prior year. It's actually interesting that most Canadians are more confident in 2020 than they are for 2021. But that certainly drives a lot of those decisions. If you go across the country, you'll see that it's relatively consistent. So the percentages that you see in each of the provinces here in the regions represent that confidence. So remember, the Canadian average is 56% think that the economy is a concern. That's what Western Canada bang on, Ontario is pretty bang on. Quebec seems a little bit more pessimistic, and Atlantic seems a little more optimistic. So I think the optimism in Atlantic is a good sign for us and retailers out here. There is a bit of dichotomy, interestingly enough, in the data. So the charts on the right show that women are less optimistic about their household finances than men at this time. There have been a number of studies over the past few months that have suggested that the female population in our country is more adversely affected by COVID than the male population. And this may be reflective in these stats. But you can see here that 34% of females compared to 23 in the prior year are less optimistic about their own household finances, which compares to 28% and 21% for males. And then on the age side of the demographic, younger Canadians are slightly less optimistic than other age groups. So you can see that 33% are reporting negative sentiments around their personal finances. And I think if you look at jobs and things like that across the country, that age group of 18 to 34, they seem to have kind of suffered in a big way from that perspective. Okay, this is one of the most interesting slides, and I'm going to pause after here, John. This is one of my favorite slides in the whole presentation because it breaks down that wallet of $1,405 amongst all the various categories, okay? So you can see the biggest part of the pie is gifts and gift cards. That's unsurprising. I just went and bought gifts for my kids, and that would fit into that category for sure. So 447, or about a third of the wallet share, or a quarter, represents gifts and gift cards. And that's down 8% from 2019. So it's less than a 10% drop. Again, that's a Canada-wide statistic, not Moncton specifically. Holiday groceries, however, are expected to increase up to $298. That's not terribly surprising because you would have an offset in outside restaurants and things like that because of potential COVID concerns. But the fact that you're staying home more means you're going to spend more on holiday groceries. $158 will go to charitable giving, which is up 86%. That's a huge stat. It's probably a big sigh of relief for a lot of charities and NPOs that are existing out there. But I thought that was a really interesting stat in kind of flying in the face of a lot of the other indicators. Alcohol and cannabis are staying about static at $126. Alcohol actually goes down slightly. Cannabis goes up slightly. The big ticket item here, though, is the bottom one, the $104 on travel. Normally, across Canada, people would spend on average $348 on travel within the holidays. It's expected to be down to $104. So that kind of reconciles all of the difference there and really captures two of the key themes. So maybe, John, I'll pause here and just see, one, if you have any questions on this, or if anyone in the chat has questions on the 5 trends, and then just kind of breakdown of the wallet share.
Okay, thanks, Steve. We do have our first question in the Q&A, and it's one that I had as well. And it really is triggered by that 66% of Canadians plan on shopping on Amazon stat, which is really staggering, but not surprising. So the question is, many New Brunswick companies either don't have a website that's e-commerce enabled, or they're not even strong on social media. So how can they possibly compete against, this Goliath like Amazon in this sort of environment?
So I'll answer that in 2 ways, John. One, brick and mortar is far from dead. That is not what the report is indicating. All it indicates is that of that, $447 in gifts that you're going to spend, a part of it's going to be spent on Amazon, a part of it's going to be spent on in-store, a part of it's going to be spent on Google, and so on and so forth. The shift is moving in that direction. So you can either pivot in one of 2 directions. One is you can move on to the digitization path as much as you possibly can, and as much as your cost structure allows for it. There's a level of complexity that comes with being online. It's becoming less and less complex and more tenable to do on a low-cost basis. So, and there'd be lots of folks in Moncton that specialize on this, John, that I'm sure they'd love to spend on Love Local for some of our kind of local professionals to help them with those items. But what is very clear from the study is that consumers still want to are still willing to pay a premium for a great experience and a premium product. Those are two things that are very clearly coming through in the report. The interesting thing that we've seen is that measures around COVID safety within the retail experience, so not having to line up for a really long time outside of your door, making sure that you have the proper sanitization, the arrows, the masks, all the stuff that makes the customer feel like you care about their personal health and safety. That is actually a really important item for the in-person experience, John, and it's obviously doesn't exist in the online part, right? So there's a bit more to this later in the report, but to me, it's clear that maybe it's following both of those paths, John, but you certainly have to be following the safety one for sure. Like your store has to feel comfortable for people to come into.
That's right. Perhaps we should be thankful that although Amazon delivers to our door, they haven't been able to replicate the warm customer experience you can get by knowing a shopkeeper and doing business there.
Yeah, and John, I'll share a slide later, but the Love Local movement is a real thing. And in spite of some of the other trends, the loyalty that exists to the local part is a real thing and a positive reason that people would go to an in-person store. So, and I know that you as a chamber have been pushing that agenda quite heavily, which is a great thing for the local economy, I think.
Great, good to hear. Okay,
Perfect.
Steve, maybe we can continue on.
Perfect. Okay, Shay, we can hit the next one. Okay. Okay, so we kind of teased this slide, but important to kind of highlight nonetheless. Online shopping continues to gain momentum. This is a quick chart that shows the preference between online or physical store. In 2014, 70% of respondents would have preferred an in-store experience, and 30% would have preferred an online experience if given the choice. In 2019, that had shifted to 38 and 62. So this trend was already happening. And then in 2020, now we're at 40 and 60. So John, to your point earlier, the preference is still in store if you look across all demographics in all of Canada, but it's moving toward more online. So it's important to just understand that stat and that it was happening before COVID. COVID is a catalyst that made it happen faster, but it was happening anyway. The next slide is probably unsurprising to most, but the preference for online is skewed toward younger demographics. So you'll see the age 18 to 34 bracket, 51% would prefer online compared to 48 in the prior year. Ages 35 to 54 remain the same at about 43, and 55 plus was 28 versus 24 in the prior year. So the 55 group is moving more toward online, but they're certainly not as high as the 18 to 34 group. So again, John, if you look at our age bracket demographics in Moncton and in New Brunswick, I think we tend to skew toward the right side of this graph as far as our population goes. So it probably indicates that we're more willing to shop at brick and mortar than the rest of the country would be. This is a fascinating slide that shows where people will shop and what the type of retailer is that they will shop at. So you'll see the list and the ranking on the left, 2019 versus 2020. There are 3 major differences in 2020 versus 2019. One, you'll see in the middle of the graph here, the warehouse membership clubs, which is Costco, really, for Moncton. That has increased from 7th place to 4th place, which means that we're more comfortable and we want to shop more for our holiday spend at Costco in Canada. If you keep going down, you'll see the other big jump was on electronics, office, and computer stores, which went from 10th place to 7th place. That could arguably be tied to more home offices being geared up. So maybe some people were working at their kitchen table for the last 6 months, and they want to set up a fancy home office. So they need a whiteboard, they need a second screen, all that stuff. So you're seeing a bigger preference to spend on holiday there. And then the big drop for all this is your kind of classic department stores. And I think that's probably directly tied to the ongoing trend of preferring online to that kind of comprehensive version of online, which is the department store. So those are really the three trends that I'll pull out of that slide. Shay, you can keep moving. The next, I'll just speak to the digital influence. So it shows where customers want to perform their shopping research. And so shopping research can be browsing around in a store. It can be clicking around on a website. So you'll see 2 or 3 big stats here that are important. You'll see that Amazon is clearly the place that retailers want to start their shopping research experience. It's 66% of people would research on Amazon versus 60 in the prior year. So it's increasing. Google comes in at second. So if the average Canadian wants to go online and find something, they're more likely to start with Amazon than Google these days, which I think wasn't always the trend. Google is up from 57 to 54. The super concerning one that, John, I think alludes to your question earlier, is the whole go to the store thing is down to 53% from 69% last year. So that's a huge drop. Some of it could be temporary because of COVID concerns. Some of it is likely permanent as part of a bigger trend. I think there's probably 2 pieces to that equation. And then interestingly, at the bottom, you'll see that recommendations from family and friends and colleagues is down to 39% from 45%. So it turns out we probably don't trust our own internal networks anymore, which is an odd stat I found in any case. The slide here just breaks down some of those findings by age group. It's not terribly surprising that in the first demographic, ages 18 to 34, that group tends to skew more toward Amazon and Google with 72 and 67%. The age is 35 to 54 tends to have a representative slice of what we had on the first slide. And then the ages 55 plus group, 63% still would prefer that in-store experience to go figure out what they want to buy for their loved ones. And so the summary on this slide is Amazon rules and Amazon Prime really rules. And so some of the really interesting stats here, we already spoke about who likes to browse on what sites. So Canada is 66% compared to 60 last year. The US, by the way, is 63%. So we like Amazon even a little bit more than the US does. On the right side of the graph, you'll see the brick and mortar preference on going to shop. We're at 53% versus 69 in the prior year, but we're better than the US. The US, only 47% of people want to go into the store to figure out what they want to buy. So those are some pretty big stats. On the bottom, I won't read all these, by the way, but on the bottom, Amazon is the primary destination for Prime members. Purchase of household goods, 53% of the time. Home items, 47% of the time. Toys and hobbies, 47% of the time. Apparel and accessories, 45%. And groceries, 27%. That wouldn't really be a thing out here quite as much, John, but this is a Canadian-wide study. And then on the right, just 2 items that I'll note. One is that 1 in 3 Canadians is an Amazon Prime member, which I thought was a huge stat. I suspect COVID and binging has helped boost those numbers, but that is totally a stat. And younger consumers are almost twice as likely as older consumers to be Amazon Prime members. So 42% for 18 to 34-year-olds and 23% for 55 plus. So the younger generation is certainly becoming Amazon Prime members, and it's likely satisfied on the speed of the transactions. So John, I might pause there. I've gone through a couple of more sections and happy to field any more questions on those items or if there's anything in the chat too.
One question I have, Steve, is what does all this mean to the future of our shopping malls and our big box stores? There's a lot of big retail space that's been an infrastructure that's been created.
Well, what's interesting about the stats, John, is it's not all doom and gloom, but it certainly requires a shift. So you saw the increase in shopping at places like Costco, right? So that's a pretty big building, and it needs to be filled up and so on, and people are going there more than they did before. So on that side of the real estate equation, I think it's positive. The negative is clearly on the department store, right? And I grew up in Moncton, so I know that everyone in New Brunswick used to come here and shop at Champlain Place. That was like the thing that people did. And so I think that has been a shifting trend that's been happening over a number of years for sure. It's hard to say if, you get vaccine tomorrow, does a lot of the shopping return? I think some of it is kind of permanently gone and shifted to either online or some of the Costco's of the world and some of the Love Locals of the world too, for sure. I think there's probably a trend there. But certainly the department store thing, it seems to be a trend that's going down. So I think we've got to be careful with, how much investment we've got there and things like that, and get creative on how we can repurpose some of those spaces.
Yeah, and I think we're starting to see that locally, even with CF Champlain and what they've done with the former Sears location, turning it into the TD Financial Center.
Absolutely. And I just saw in the news that there's 100 more jobs coming in for that one for Mr. McKenna. So that's a good thing too.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, Steve, feel free to continue.
Perfect. Okay, we'll keep going. So just some of the consumer behaviors during the holidays that will be observed. And so this is it's a pretty busy slide, admittedly. I'll just highlight a couple of things, but this is the reason that someone would visit a store. Okay, so that's a very important item. Better prices is the top item on the list. Free shipping, interestingly, is high up on the list as well. So remember, this is a store that includes physical and virtual. Okay, so those are the top two. But three items that have kind of shifted. One is if a friend or family recommends is down to 36% versus 45% in the prior year. And so again, for some reason, we trust our friends and family less than we did before. New types of products and services is less important than it was last year as well. It was 30% before, now it's, it was 38% before, now it's 30%. A pleasant shopping experience is down to 27% versus 32%. It reflects a bit of a trend where people see shopping as transactional rather than an event. And I think that part of it is that, when you go to a store now, you can't really sip on a coffee the way you could before because of the COVID rules. So some of these are an anomaly that's tied to the pandemic versus a longer term trend. But generally, one of the trends that we've seen is, that concept of kind of leisurely out shopping for a few hours, grabbing a coffee while you're doing it, browsing around very casually, that seems to be on the decline, and people are more so interested in getting in there quick, getting what they need, and finding what they want and then getting out. The bottom one is super important, which is COVID-19 safety precautions. So 36% would cite that as a very important reason that they would shop at a store. Obviously, that didn't exist as a comparative in the prior year, but it's certainly a reason that people would not go to a store if they don't feel that the store appreciates their kind of health and safety requirements and so on. So I think that's an important element to kind of highlight. Maybe we'll skip, I'm just looking at the time, we might skip ahead for this one, Shay. Perfect. Okay, so this is an interesting one. Canadians are scaling back their holiday entertaining this season. I think that's the reason that is there is pretty obviously some of the pandemic rules that exist. Normally I would have a big blowout Christmas party for my team that would be in person. We'd rent one of the hotels out in Moncton and we'd have a big giant dinner for 200 people. that seems less likely that it's going to be possible this year with the orange phase and the threat of an orange phase. So, companies will have to pivot, people will have to pivot. The rules around who's allowed to go in your house and things like that are changing all the time. So the expectation is that 26% of Canadians plan to do some form of in-home holiday entertaining, and over half, 51%, plan to avoid entertaining altogether. So these are really important stats. If you look at whether they will have a formal sit-down meal at home with their family and friends, 31% say yes, which is a big number. Remember that in Atlantic Canada, until very recently, we had huge success with the Atlantic bubble. At being in the yellow phase, we could see some people and so on. This is a Canada-wide study. In Toronto, you cannot imagine seeing your family and friends in your house. It just doesn't happen. And so a lot of these stats are skewed toward maybe some of the more Western provinces than we would be. I suspect our numbers might be a little bit higher. But then 47% would say they're not going to have an in-home dinner this year. Interestingly, on the bottom left, 41% of Canadians say they'll provide hand sanitizers if they have any guests over during the holidays. 22% will ask guests how they're feeling before they come inside the home. 10% will ask guests to wear masks while inside their home. So these are pretty meaningful pieces of information, I think. If we go to the next slide, Shay, I did mention earlier that kind of in-home grocery costs are expected to go up. This is a breakdown of where people will spend their money. So Loblaws would be one of the biggest decreases year over year. In the past year, they were by far the most dominant at 31%. That's only expected to be 24% this year. So that would be Superstore for us in Atlantic Canada. Costco is expected to increase from 13 to 15%, which puts them for the first time above Sobeys and Walmart, both of whom went up slightly. The LCBO, SAQ, NB Liquors of the world, that's expected to decrease from 11% to 6%. And a lot of that could be attributed to the new rules around having alcohol sold in grocery stores. So if you're going to pick up your 12-pack of Bud Light, you can do it at Sobeys instead of NB Liquor, then maybe you'll do that. The bottom one is the most interesting one, I think, for some of our Moncton retailers, John, where you see the other going from 19% to 24%. That would be like the Dolmas of the world or the markets and things like that. So I think it's a real positive that you see 19 to 24 in that category for sure. The next couple slides are just going to go through some of the biggest kind of COVID impacts, and these are general economic discussion items here. But as far as what the impact was to the average Canadian consumer, 34% would have reported experiencing losses to finances. So that's investments and RRSPs and so on. So you'll see a big shift on the blue bar. That's the 55 plus crowd. And so they were hammered pretty hard on their kind of investments, retirement plans, et cetera. They're probably more focused on it as well. The second big bar you'll see is my household impact was reduced. My household income was reduced 29%. And the biggest one there is the younger generation at 37%. So that's the 18 to 35 crowd. And then the next one on the right, my household expenses increased. Only 26% said that was the case. I think household expenses decreasing was actually a big trend as well. It's just not on this slide. And then on the far right, you'll see 32% said that they weren't impacted by the pandemic. So just to give you a flavor for what the average Canadian consumer has been feeling. Next slide, Shay. Okay, this graph just shows how Canadians shop and on their spending habits. So 52% say more home cooking, 50% avoid enclosed malls. So John, to your question earlier around the malls, that's an important element for sure. 47% buy more online. 39% stock up the pantry in bulk. I think we saw that early in the pandemic, and in some places it's continued. 26% avoid physical stores, and 25% use deliveries more. Not to say that it's it's down universally, the physical store thing, but they certainly might use delivery options. They might go in less frequently, but buy more deliberately. And so they'll go in and buy quick rather than just browse around. So if you want to keep going, Shay. Safety precautions in stores is a really important item. And so if you look on the right graph here, consumers rate importance of retail's COVID-19 safety precautions. 87% think it's important, 12% think it's not important. So it's a very clear message in the survey that people care about that type of stuff. Okay, I'm going to keep motoring through so that we don't run out of time. David's going to speak very soon here. So on the holiday season timing, the only thing I'm going to highlight here is that there's a bigger statistic where people will be shopping after Black Friday than it was in the past. So people are a little bit later in their shopping than they were before. The other thing is that Boxing Week is expected to be less than it was in the past, and that's tied to Black Friday spending and Cyber Monday spending. So in the past, Boxing Day was kind of the be all end all of getting all your deals. That has been shifted to the other 2 days as well. Okay, so next I'm going to just go through these last 2 slides that segue very well into David's conversation, and it's around consumer data and privacy. So generally, if you keep going, there we go. Thank you, Shay. Generally, consumers are fairly comfortable sharing some basic demographics on their privacy. So things like gender, race, address, postal code, they might be comfortable. Financial history, social media presence, absolutely not. And I find the social media one a little bit ironic because of the sheer volume of personal information that people will share on Facebook and Twitter and so on very naturally. Interestingly, they're very shy on sharing their social media presence with others. So that's kind of an interesting dichotomy there for sure. And then Shay, if you can flip one more slide over. There is certainly a trend where consumers are more willing to share information with some organizations than others. And so it all ties back to trust. But certainly, medical services, government, they would be likely to be willing to share that type of information. But when you get into retailers and so on, they're not. And that's where, you kind of look at why, and you tie back to a very important stat, which is, I think it was 1 in 3 Canadians at this point have been subject to some form of cyber attack or personal identity theft or so on. So, over the years, it has impacted all of us, and it continues to do so. You look at, the city of St. John and the terrible cyber attack that they just experienced, and it's, still impacting them now. So, a lot of these things are front and center. And that goes counter to a lot of the digitization efforts and e-commerce items that we had talked about earlier. So we do have David Gibbs on the phone, and I'm going to ask him a few questions related to cyber, just for some folks on the line to think about. So one, David, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to Moncton virtually. So one, what are you seeing from a cyber threat perspective specific to retailers? What are you seeing out there?
Perfect. Thanks, Steve, and thanks everyone for letting us enjoy the day with you. So from a threat perspective, right, the cyber threats and the threat landscape is vast. And, while there is commonalities across industries, within retail, there are certain areas which are more prevalent. And, Steve's touched on a few of these with respect to, social engineering and attackers leveraging your social profile or your business's social profile to sort of mask themselves and become, almost try to become an employee of the organization and pretend that they are an employee and deal with your customers. We're also seeing, from a retail perspective and I guess even as part of COVID, right? And, while the The issues haven't changed. The theme has, so around phishing attempts to gain credentials to your systems, or again, posing as an employee. We're also seeing, increased sophistication of some of these threats and how they're being manifested in organizations. And then, a lot of this puts the onus on employees and owners to be aware, and how do they protect against this. So, even with respect to retailers, and as they move online and are dealing with customers more virtually, we're seeing an increase in the number of malicious attachments that will maybe install malware on your computer, links that take you somewhere else. Business email compromise, which sort of shuts down your ability to communicate with customers, an increase in email spam, and then also, just plain old credential phishing. Can we get access to your system by posing as maybe a fake bank or iTunes as an example, to say, please enter your email and password, and quite frankly, a lot of people are trusting and will still do this.
Yeah, I see them regularly, David. I was just quote unquote offered a job by email this morning, which is was a little suspect, but it's amazing the attempts that are out there. What's typically the weakest link or attack point that you see?
So sad but true, but your weakest link is typically still employees or users with a low security awareness. They are the front line of defense. And in a retail perspective, employees are a pretty critical role in preventing against fraud, taking credit card transactions, spotting the customer, no different than as we move online. They play they are typically the first point of attack. And so, as we deal with emails, and, do we know who's sending us the email? Are we expecting the email? Are we expecting that attachment? Do we know who our vendors or third parties are, or some of the suppliers that we're making payments to? Again, a lot of this comes down to the front line with the employees and some of that low security awareness. And I would say, coming in a close second is just some of our third parties. We're dealing with more and more organizations. We sort of have that trust relationship. We trust that they're doing the same things, that their security awareness is as high as ours, but quite frankly, it's not. And so they also pose a lot of threats to our organization as well, especially in terms of if they have sensitive information, such as our banking information, to make payments or to collect payments, or even credentials to access our networks for some reason. So those are typically the two weakest attack points that we're vulnerable today.
Any other attack areas that retailers should be concerned about?
Yes, absolutely. So, seeing a couple of things here. First is around, as we move to a more online e-commerce presence, it is amazing the number of shadow IT or mirrored websites that we see by perpetrators that basically copying an organization's brand, selling the same products, but they're not. They're collecting sales and collecting credit card information and collecting fake sales, which are taking away from the retailers. And then, with common online presence, you have the same old, some hobbyist cyber perpetrators just looking to cause noise in the system. So whether that's sort of a denial of service type attack, where we bring your website down, you can no longer do business, or you're impacted by that. Cart loading, so loading up products in carts, which then takes away from your online inventory ability to demonstrate to customers that you have products available. Lots of different little things that that come back to the website, and just making sure that we're aware of what's going on in our online presence, not just our in-store presence.
If I think of the audience in this room, David, what do you think some of the actions might be that real attendees in the real city of Moncton might do to be more kind of cyber aware or cyber secure?
So cybersecurity isn't always a one-size-fits-all approach, but there are, I'll say 5 basic principles, and they all relate to one another in one way, shape, or form. So, one is focus on your crown jewels. And what does that really mean? So, your crown jewels are your data assets or your critical things that keep you in business. Focus your effort there first. So if you have customer lists and a whole bunch of other things, maybe that customer list is most important to you. Focus on your crown jewel. You can't protect everything equally, so figure out where you're going to protect first. Practice good cyber hygiene. What does that mean? So, we're all using and leveraging information technology, iPhones. Software becomes outdated. That is one of the first places that attackers will look to penetrate your network. So making sure that your systems and software is up to date and fully patched, that is one small step that you can take that ensures that the attackers aren't leveraging vulnerabilities in older versions to get into your systems. Preparing for the inevitable, right? The old adage goes, it's not a matter of when, not a matter of if now, but when. At some point, you will be compromised or subject to some form of cyber annoyance. So what can you do to prepare for the inevitable? Make sure that you've got good backup processes so that you can restore. So in the instance of a ransomware attack, can you restore your systems to a point where it is acceptable to you and so you can resume business? Prepare for the inevitable in terms of what is your communication plan? What are you going to do to resume your business quickly? We don't need, maybe you don't need to have it all solved so that you can resume within an hour, but start asking yourself these types of questions in terms of what if it happened to us, what would we do? The fourth area is just educating your employees, becoming more cyber aware. So, we're all too quick to sometimes click on that link, respond to that email. Again, it's building trust with some of our providers, but also having some awareness to say, are we expecting that email? Again, we're dealing with a lot of customers and requests through email and online communication. Are we expecting that? Are we calling the customers to validate rather than just process? Those types of things. Making sure that our employees are aware is a great first step. And then, just staying vigilant to the various cyber threats. When we think of other organizations that have been hit by cyber attacks, just ask yourself, could that have happened to us? What are we doing to prevent it? What would they, the attackers, be looking to come into our organization and try to either exfiltrate or do malicious activities? Mm-hmm. So those are, a couple of simple takeaways for us to all consider about being a little bit more cyber secure.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Dave. I know you're a crazy busy guy these days with cyber attacks on the rise across the board. So thank you very much for all the good tips for our friends in Moncton. John, we're pretty much at the end of our presentation. I see we're at 11:55. So, geez, we must be good at hitting the time. So that's good. Is there any questions that we want to take over the next 5 minutes or so?
There's just one question that I'd like to close on, Steve, and that sort of ties back to consumer confidence, which I think any of the kind of negative data points really can be linked to maybe some lagging consumer confidence. Do you think that confidence in the economy and spending is tied directly to the vaccine? Once we start to see people actually being inoculated, some of our friends or healthcare workers, that there might be a little bit of pent-up demand to spend. Those of us who were fortunate enough to have employment through COVID, we haven't been traveling, we haven't been eating out as much, and we might have some cash to spend in the second half of 2021.
Absolutely, John. I think that they're inextricably linked. So you can tell from the orange phase all of the things that you were doing in yellow that you can no longer do in orange, right? So, if you had a coffee with a client or a lunch or something like that, or a close colleague that you were dealing with before, now you cannot. And so as long as the threat of an orange or a red or what have you looms, I think that the general population will always think of next year as, that's going to be tough and it's going to be a tough year and so on. Once there is a light at the end of the tunnel, or there is a prize to be attained, which is your kind of vaccination scenario, I think it's for sure that people will start to see optimism again and see a rebound. You also look back to March and April when the insanity was happening, right? You saw sales drop for so many businesses overnight, and some of it was just sheer panic from purchasers and consumers and so on. Then you saw this huge bump back up in May and June. So like car sales, for example, went really low in March and April, but then there was a huge spike in May and June. And so I think, John, there's a whole host of elements to our economy where that's essentially happening, but over a longer period of time. And so when the vaccine comes and we're able to get back to some level of normalcy, then yeah, I think that confidence in the economy will rebound as well, hopefully anyway.
Well, perhaps it's best that we end on that sort of optimistic note today. I'd like to thank both Steve and David for their presentation on the holiday retail outlook and the cybersecurity side of that as well, both for retailers and for consumers as we move forward. And just want everyone to know that Deloitte's really been a solid partner and supporter of the Chamber of Commerce now for several years, and we look forward to continuing that relationship in 2021.
Certainly, us too.
Okay, great. Before I sign off, I just want to draw your attention. Steve, you mentioned a couple of times kind of love for local, and actually just today, the Chamber in partnership with Brainworks Marketing and Medivy has launched something called A Very Local Holiday. And it's a campaign to really reinforce the need to support your local retailers and shops and restaurants through December here. And so if you'd like to get any details on that, you can find those on our website or on the loveforlocal.ca website. And there will be daily prizes, I should also mention. So show some local love and you can get something nice for the holidays. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's presentation, for your questions. We have just one more Zoom webinar in 2020, and that will feature the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, Paul Beaudry, on December the 10th. Mr. Beaudry will give the bank's analysis on what lies ahead for interest rates and monetary policy in 2021. And you can still sign up for that session on our website. Thanks again, Steve and David and Deloitte. Thanks again, everyone, for attending. Please stay well and stay safe. Shop local. Merci et bonne journée.
Everyone, thanks.
Thank you.
Merci.